Hey guys, medieval baths were not rare simply because people loved being dirty. The stranger truth is that bathing sat at the crossroads of fuel, fear, religion, labor, privacy, disease, and money, and in many medieval towns, getting clean could be far more complicated than it sounds. Tell me where you're watching from, and what quiet corner of history you'd like us to explore next. And if you enjoy thoughtful long-form history, liking the video is a simple way to support it. You can also subscribe for more calm, quietly fascinating history told with patience and care. So tonight, we begin with a world where water was everywhere, yet a warm bath was never just water. To understand why medieval baths became so rare, we have to begin by letting go of one of the easiest modern assumptions. It is tempting to imagine the Middle Ages as 1,000 years of people simply refusing cleanliness, as though dirt itself was a custom, or as though people looked at washing as something strange and unnecessary. But that picture is too simple. Medieval people noticed smells. They noticed sweat. They washed hands before meals. They rinsed faces, combed hair, cleaned clothing when they could, and understood that visible filth could mark a person as careless, poor, sick, or socially undesirable. The problem was not that cleanliness meant nothing. The problem was that a full bath, especially a warm one, required a small chain of resources that many people could not easily command. A bath needed water, and water was heavy. It needed fuel, and fuel was expensive. It needed a vessel large enough to sit in, a space private enough to undress, and enough time away from animals, children, work, smoke, cooking, and other household demands. In a modern bathroom, all of these conditions disappear behind pipes, drains, heaters, tiles, and doors. In a medieval home, each condition had to be created by hand. That is the first quiet reversal. The medieval bath was not rare because water was unknown. It was rare because comfort was labor. In a village, water might come from a stream, a spring, a pond, or a well. In a town, it might come from a public fountain, a shared well, or a water carrier who sold it in containers. But bringing enough water for bathing into a home was not a small task. A single bucket was awkward. Several buckets were exhausting. And if the household wanted warm water, the work had only begun. Someone had to gather wood, buy charcoal, tend the fire, heat the water gradually, and pour it without wasting too much of it. The warmth that feels ordinary to us was, for many medieval people, a visible use of household resources. Fuel may be the most overlooked reason of all. In many parts of medieval Europe, wood was not just something lying freely around for anyone to burn. It was managed, gathered, bought, taxed, restricted, or competed over. Firewood cooked meals. It heated rooms. It dried damp clothes. It helped with craft work. It kept infants, the elderly, and the sick alive through cold nights. To use a large amount of fuel for a bath meant taking it away from something else. So even when medieval people washed, they often washed in smaller, more practical ways. A basin, a cloth, warmed water for hands and face, a rinse before prayer, before eating, before sleeping, or before a social encounter. Clean linen could matter as much as clean skin, because linen absorbed sweat and could be changed more often than a whole body could be bathed. In wealthier households, servants might bring water to a chamber and prepare a tub. In poorer households, bathing was more occasional, more improvised, and far less private. And privacy itself was part of the story. Many ordinary medieval homes were crowded. A single room might contain a family, bedding, stored tools, food, small animals, smoke from a hearth, and the constant movement of daily life. Even in better houses, rooms were not arranged around modern ideas of personal space. Undressing completely was not always convenient, especially in cold weather, in cramped quarters, or in households where servants and relatives moved in and out. A bath required not only water, but a temporary break in the social rhythm of the home. That is why public bathhouses once mattered so much. In many medieval towns, especially in the earlier and high medieval centuries, public baths were not unknown at all. Some towns had bathhouses where people could wash, sweat, socialize, eat, drink, receive grooming services, or sometimes conduct business. These places inherited something from Roman traditions, from local customs, and from the simple urban need for shared facilities. They were often heated. They were more efficient than heating bathwater separately in every home. They allowed townspeople, especially those without large houses, access to a kind of cleanliness that would otherwise be difficult. But the public bathhouse also carried a contradiction. It solved one problem while creating several others. It made bathing easier, but it made bathing public. It made warmth possible, but it concentrated bodies, steam, conversation, gossip, moral anxiety, and sometimes sexual commerce in the same space. The more a bathhouse became a place of leisure rather than simple washing, the more suspicion could gather around it. Not everywhere, and not all at once, but gradually, in many cities, the bathhouse became associated not only with cleanliness, but with temptation, disorder, mixed company, and behavior that civic or religious authorities found difficult to control. This is where the common story often becomes misleading. It is too easy to say, the church hated bathing, and leave it there. The reality was more uneven. Medieval Christianity did not have one simple rule that declared washing sinful. Monastic communities had washing customs. Hospitals and infirmaries could include bathing for care. Pilgrims, priests, nobles, and ordinary people all lived in a world where water had practical and symbolic importance. Baptism itself gave water profound religious meaning. But suspicion could arise around excess, vanity, nakedness, mixed bathing, and pleasure. A bath taken for health or necessity was not the same as an afternoon in a noisy bathhouse filled with eating, drinking, flirting, and reputation risks. Moral criticism often focused less on water touching skin and more on the social world that grew around certain bathing spaces. So the decline of bathing in parts of medieval and early modern Europe was not a single decision. It was a slow tightening of pressures. There were economic pressures. Heating large amounts of water became costly. Urban fuel demand rose. Bathhouses required maintenance, wood, staff, clean supply, drainage, and regulation. If fuel prices climbed or civic authorities imposed restrictions, bathhouses became harder to run profitably. There were social pressures. Respectable households might worry about reputation. Reform-minded preachers might warn against public luxury. City officials might associate bathhouses with disorder. Families might decide that partial washing at home was safer, cheaper, and less exposed. And then came the pressure of disease. Late medieval Europe lived with repeated outbreaks of plague and other illnesses. People did not understand germs in the modern sense, but they did observe patterns or thought they did. They feared foul air, corrupted environments, crowded spaces, and bodily vulnerability. In some medical thinking, heat and steam could open the pores. Open pores, in turn, were imagined as making the body more vulnerable to bad air, infection, or invisible corruption. This idea was not foolish within their own framework. If disease was believed to move through poisoned air or imbalance, then a hot bath that softened the body and opened it to the surrounding atmosphere could seem risky. To a modern listener, this sounds backward. We associate washing with health. But medieval and early modern medical logic worked from different assumptions. Health was often explained through humors, temperature, moisture, air, digestion, and balance. A bath could be prescribed in some situations and avoided in others. It could soothe, weaken, cleanse, or endanger, depending on timing, condition, season, and the kind of water used. That is one of the most important things to remember. Medieval people were not simply irrational. They were reasoning from the best systems available to them, systems that mixed observation, inherited medical tradition, religious thought, and practical caution. When repeated epidemics made crowded bathing places look dangerous, avoiding them could feel like common sense. The public bathhouse, once useful and even fashionable in some towns, now carried a darker set of associations. It might be expensive. It might be morally questionable. It might be medically risky. It might be linked to disorder. And in later centuries, as concerns about certain contagious diseases grew, some cities restricted or closed bathhouses altogether. But even then, people did not stop cleaning themselves entirely. This is another useful correction. The rarity of full baths should not be confused with the absence of hygiene. Medieval cleanliness often worked through smaller habits. People washed hands. They wiped the body with cloths. They combed hair. They cleaned teeth in various simple ways. They valued fresh-smelling herbs, clean garments, and orderly appearance. In elite circles, scented water, rose water, linen changes, and careful grooming could all signal refinement. For the wealthy, bathing could become a controlled domestic luxury. A noble household might have servants to carry and heat water. A tub could be lined with cloth for comfort. Herbs might be added. Warm bathing might accompany medical care, childbirth recovery, travel, or preparation for special occasions. Some castles and manor houses had facilities that made washing easier than in a peasant cottage. But even among elites, frequent full-body bathing was not necessarily as automatic as it is for us. It still required organization. For the poor, the difference was sharper. A laborer returning from fields or workshops might be sweaty, dusty, and tired, but the household fire had other priorities. Food had to be cooked. Animals had to be tended. Clothing had to be dried. Children had to be managed. In winter, the room itself might be cold enough that undressing for a bath felt unpleasant or even dangerous. Washing the face, hands, neck, and feet might be far more practical than immersing the whole body. And this makes medieval cleanliness feel less like a simple moral choice and more like a negotiation with limits. The climate mattered. In colder regions, bathing in winter was harder, especially without reliable heated interiors. In towns, water quality mattered. A nearby river might also receive waste from tanning, dyeing, butchering, washing, and household disposal. Wells could be cleaner or less clean depending on location and maintenance. People might prefer certain sources for drinking and others for washing, but their choices were not always ideal. A warm bath prepared from questionable water was not automatically refreshing. Urban density added its own discomfort. Medieval towns were places of craft, trade, animals, smoke, mud, market refuse, and human crowding. Cleanliness was never only personal. A person could wash and then step into a street where rain mixed with waste, where animals passed, where carts churned mud, and where smells from workshops drifted through the air. The body lived inside an environment that resisted modern ideas of cleanliness at every turn. This is why the medieval bath is such a revealing subject. It opens a door into the whole material world. You cannot explain it properly without talking about fuel, architecture, labor, medicine, religion, gender, class, disease, water systems, and the difference between private and public life. A bath seems like a small domestic act. In the medieval world, it belonged to an entire economy of effort. There is also an important difference between regions. Medieval Europe was not one uniform place. Bathing habits varied by century, town, wealth, climate, and cultural contact. Some areas maintained stronger bathing traditions than others. In parts of the Islamic world, public bathhouses remained deeply embedded in urban life, connected to ritual washing, sociability, and civic infrastructure. In Jewish communities, ritual bathing had its own religious meaning. In some European cities, bathhouses thrived for long periods before suspicion and regulation increased. So when we say medieval baths were rare, we have to ask, rare for whom, where, and when? A peasant in a cold rural village did not live like a merchant in a busy German town. A noblewoman in a well-managed household did not bathe under the same conditions as a journeyman apprentice sleeping in cramped quarters. A monk in an infirmary did not experience cleanliness like a traveler arriving exhausted at an inn. The Middle Ages were full of unevenness. That unevenness is exactly what makes the topic interesting. The bath was not just an object. It was a social position. If you had servants, storage, fuel, privacy, and time, bathing could become part of comfort, care, and display. If you had none of those things, it became an occasional undertaking. If you lived near a reliable bathhouse, you had one set of choices. If you lived far from one, or if local authorities frowned on them, your choices narrowed. If disease rumors spread, a habit that once felt healthy might suddenly feel dangerous. And as the centuries moved toward the later medieval and early modern periods, that fear became more influential. The body itself began to be imagined in a more cautious way. The skin was not only a surface to clean, it was also a boundary that could be opened, weakened, or penetrated. Steam, heat, and soaking could seem less like purification and more like exposure. In that world of thought, keeping the body protected could matter more than washing it deeply. This shift helps explain why linen became so important in later ideas of cleanliness. Clean shirts, shifts, undergarments, and cloths could be seen as drawing impurities away from the body. Changing linen could stand in for washing, especially among those who could afford enough fabric. To be clean was not necessarily to bathe often. It could mean to wear clean linen, maintain orderly grooming, avoid visible grime, and keep the body socially acceptable. That sounds strange only because our definition of cleanliness has changed. Modern cleanliness is built around plumbing. Turn a handle and water arrives. Turn another and it warms. Waste disappears through drains. Privacy is built into the room. Soap is cheap. Towels are abundant. Laundry machines separate sweat from daily life with almost no thought. Because our infrastructure is invisible, we imagine cleanliness as a personal habit. But in the medieval world, cleanliness was infrastructure, and infrastructure was scarce. The full bath asked a household to gather the world into one room. Water from outside, heat from fuel, labor from someone's arms, privacy from a crowded building, time from a working day, and confidence from a medical culture that did not always agree that bathing was safe. When all of that came together, a bath could be pleasant, even luxurious. When it did not, people adapted. They washed in pieces. They cleaned what was visible. They managed smell with herbs, smoke, fresh cloth, and distance. They accepted levels of bodily discomfort that modern people would find difficult. They did not always think of this as neglect. Often, it was simply the ordinary arrangement of life. And yet, there is still a deeper irony here. The medieval person who avoided a hot bath out of caution was not always rejecting health. In many cases, they were trying to preserve it. They feared chill after bathing. They feared bad air. They feared crowded houses of steam. They feared moral danger and social shame. They feared wasting fuel needed for survival. A choice that looks dirty from the outside could feel prudent from within. This is where the story becomes more human. We are not looking at people who lack senses. We are looking at people whose choices were shaped by burdens we no longer see. Imagine a winter evening in a small medieval town. The streets are damp. Smoke hangs low from hearths. A household returns from labor, trade, errands, and market noise. There is water, yes, but not in a pipe. There is heat, yes, but not enough to spend carelessly. There is a body that wants rest, but rest itself has duties attached to it. A child needs feeding. A cloak must dry. Pot must be watched. A tool must be repaired. The fire must last. In that setting, the idea of a long warm bath is not impossible. It is simply expensive in every sense. And if a bathhouse stands nearby, steaming and noisy, it may offer relief. But it may also ask for money, reputation, and risk. Who is inside? What will people say? Is the water wholesome? Is the air safe? Is the pleasure worth the suspicion? For a young apprentice, a widow, a respectable merchant's wife, a traveling craftsman, or a priest, the answer might be different. That is why the decline of medieval bathing cannot be explained by one sentence. It was not just dirt. It was not just religion. It was not just plague. It was not just poverty. It was the meeting point of all these things, and each one made the warm bath a little harder to justify. As we move further into this world, the next question becomes even more revealing. If people bathed less often than we do, how did they actually manage the body day by day? Because the answer is not simply that they did nothing. It leads us into the quiet routines of basins, linen, hair, hands, teeth, smells, sickness, shame, and the small daily strategies that allowed medieval people to appear clean enough in a world that made deep cleanliness so difficult. Those small daily strategies began not with a grand wooden tub, but with the objects that could be lifted, warmed, carried, rinsed, folded, and used again. A basin on a table, a pitcher beside a bed, a strip of linen, a comb made of bone, wood, or horn, a little scented water if the household could afford it, a handful of herbs, a knife for trimming nails. These were not the dramatic signs of medieval cleanliness, but they were the ordinary tools by which people negotiated the body every day. Hands mattered first. In a world where most meals were eaten without forks, where bread, fingers, knives, bowls, and shared vessels all met at the table, washing the hands before eating was not a strange luxury. It was polite, practical, and socially expected in many settings. In noble households, water might be brought to guests before a meal, sometimes with ceremony, sometimes with scented additions, and sometimes with towels carefully offered. Among poorer people, the gesture was simpler, but the idea remained recognizable. A person did not need a private bathroom to understand that dirty hands at a meal were unpleasant. This is one reason the medieval world looks different when we move away from the full bath. If the question is, did medieval people bathe like modern people? The answer is no. But if the question is, did medieval people have habits of cleaning? The answer becomes much more complicated. They cleaned the body in sections. They cleaned at moments when cleanliness had social meaning. They cleaned before food, before prayer, before sleep, before intimacy, before important visits, and sometimes after work when water and time allowed. The routine was fragmented, but it was not absent. Faces were washed. Eyes were cleared. Beards were combed. Hair was managed, covered, braided, cut, oiled, or hidden according to age, class, occupation, marital status, and local custom. A woman's head covering, a man's cap, a hood, a veil, or a coif did more than mark social position. It also helped manage hair in a world of smoke, dust, sweat, rain, and insects. Covering the head could be modest, practical, respectable, warm, and clean all at once. Hair could become a quiet battlefield between comfort and appearance. Long hair trapped smoke and sweat. Beards collected crumbs and smells. Lice and nits were common enough that combing was not merely cosmetic. Fine-toothed combs show up again and again in archaeological finds because they were useful tools, not decorative fantasies. A comb could remove tangles, dust, loose dirt, and pests. To sit by the hearth and comb hair was not just grooming. It was a small act of maintenance in a world where the body was constantly exposed to the environment. And here again, a detail that feels small reveals something larger. Cleanliness was not only about water. It was about repeated attention. The person who could not take a warm bath might still wash the face, change a linen shift, comb the hair, rinse the mouth, trim nails, shake out bedding, or rub the skin with cloth. Each act did a little work. None replaced the modern shower, but together they formed a pattern of care that made sense under medieval conditions. The cloth was especially important. Linen sat between the body and the outer world. A shirt, shift, smock, or undergarment absorbed sweat and oils from the skin. It protected woolen outer clothing, which was harder to wash thoroughly and slower to dry. Wool could be brushed, aired, beaten, and repaired, but frequent soaking could damage shape, shrink fibers, or require time and space that many households lacked. Linen, though laborious to produce, could be washed more readily. For those who owned enough of it, changing linen was one of the clearest ways to feel cleaner. This created a quiet divide between classes. A wealthy person might not bathe daily, but they could change linen more often, sleep in cleaner sheets, use finer towels, and keep outer garments from touching the skin too closely. A poor laborer might own very little clothing and wear the same underlayer until washing became unavoidable or until opportunity allowed. So when later observers describe clean linen as a sign of refinement, they are revealing a practical truth. Cleanliness depended not only on water, but on how many layers of cloth a person could spare. Laundry itself was heavy work. Washing cloth was not a neat domestic button pressed in the corner of a room. It meant water, beating, soaking, rubbing, wringing, drying, and often carrying loads to and from a stream, pond, public wash place, or yard. Soap might be available in some places, especially as trade and craft production developed, but it was not always cheap or universally used in the modern sense. Ash, lye, fuller's earth, urine in some textile processes, and other cleaning substances belonged to a world in which cleanliness could smell harsh before it smelled fresh. The laundress, whether working for a household, a monastery, an inn, or a noble residence, occupied an important but often overlooked place in the medieval economy of cleanliness. She did not merely make things look neat. She extended the life of clothing. She made bodies more socially acceptable. She allowed people of means to appear clean without necessarily bathing often. Her work took place in cold water, damp air, sore hands, and repetitive strain, and yet the result could be read by others as personal respectability. That is one of the quiet injustices of the medieval body. One person's cleanliness often rested on another person's labor. A lord's fresh shirt, a merchant's clean table linen, a guest's wash towel, or a household's bedding did not appear by magic. Someone hauled the water. Someone heated it if necessary. Someone scrubbed the cloth. Someone dried it despite rain, smoke, mud, and winter air. In a large household, the cleaner the upper ranks appeared, the more hidden labor likely stood behind that appearance. The same was true of water brought for washing. In elite settings, a person might experience cleanliness as service. A basin appeared. A servant poured. Towels were ready. A chamber could be warmed. The act felt private and controlled. But outside that narrow world, cleanliness was more exposed. The poor might wash at a communal source, rinse in a stream, share a basin, or make do at the edge of the working day. The difference was not simply taste. It was access. Even the mouth had its own modest practices. Medieval people did not use modern dentistry, but they were not completely indifferent to teeth and breath. Some used cloths, toothpicks, powders, salt, herbs, or chewing substances. Medical and household texts sometimes offered advice for cleaning teeth or sweetening breath. Fresh breath mattered in close social spaces, especially among elites. Bad teeth were common, pain was common, and remedies could be limited, but the desire to avoid foulness was real. Smell was one of the most complicated parts of medieval life because it was everywhere and yet not always judged as modern people would judge it. Streets smelled of animals, smoke, mud, market goods, leatherworking, cooking, damp wool, human waste, beer, bread, fish, candles, and open fires. A person's body smell existed inside that larger atmosphere. Modern deodorant did not exist, and people were accustomed to stronger natural odors. But this does not mean they liked every smell or ignored the social meaning of stench. A bad smell could suggest sickness, poverty, moral disorder, old age, corruption, or poor household management. Pleasant smells, by contrast, could signal status and care. Herbs might be strewn on floors. Lavender, rosemary, rue, mint, rosewater, and other scents could be used in various ways depending on region and availability. Scented waters and pomanders later became part of elite culture, but even earlier, the idea that smell mattered was deeply familiar. The air itself was thought to affect health. This was not simply an aesthetic concern. Under miasma theories, foul air could be dangerous. A rotting smell, a stagnant ditch, a corrupt vapor, a crowded room, or a diseased street could all seem medically threatening. So medieval cleaning could include more than washing the body. It could mean airing a room, burning certain substances, removing waste, changing bedding, or avoiding places believed to be unwholesome. And yet, the home constantly fought against freshness. Many households lived with smoke. The central hearth warmed, cooked, dried, and lit the dwelling, but it also filled rooms with soot and irritation. Clothes absorbed it, hair absorbed it, walls darkened with it, eyes watered from it. A person might wash in the morning and still carry smoke by evening. For those living in one-room homes, cleanliness was not a state one achieved and kept. It was something constantly undone by the environment. This is why a medieval person's sense of clean enough was not identical to ours. The goal was often not perfect freshness. The goal was manageability. The body had to be tolerable to oneself, acceptable to others, and suited to one's station. A monk, a knight, a laundress, a student, a butcher, a midwife, a noblewoman, and a plowman each lived with different expectations. Cleanliness was moral, medical, social, and practical, but never evenly distributed. A student in a university town, for example, might share cramped lodgings, own limited clothing, eat in communal settings, and live among books, candles, taverns, arguments, and street noise. His cleanliness might depend on access to servants, public facilities, or a landlord's arrangements. An apprentice in a workshop could sleep near the place he worked, absorbing the smells of leather, metal, dye, flour, wax, or wood shavings. A servant in a noble household might help create cleanliness for others while having little privacy for himself or herself. A peasant woman's cleanliness carried its own pressures. She might work in fields, tend animals, bake, brew, cook, wash children, mend clothes, carry water, and manage household fires. Her hands could be rough from water and work, her clothing marked by labor, yet her competence might be judged partly by the order of the home and the condition of family linen. The body that modern viewers might imagine as simply dirty was often a working body, surrounded by duties that made ideal cleanliness difficult. Children added another layer. They were washed, wiped, swaddled, changed, and cleaned as far as resources allowed, but childhood in the medieval world was physically messy. Infants created laundry. Toddlers crawled through floors that were not sterile. Older children worked, played, ran errands, tended animals, and slept in crowded spaces. Keeping children clean was not a private parenting preference. It was another form of labor, mostly falling within the household's daily survival. The sick were different again. Bathing could be part of care in some medical settings, especially when physicians or caregivers believed warmth, moisture, or cleansing would help. Hospitals, monasteries, and infirmaries might provide forms of washing not available to ordinary homes. But sickness also made bathing risky. A weak patient could be chilled. A feverish body could be treated according to theories of heat and moisture that now seem distant to us. The same bath that comforted one patient might be avoided for another. This uncertainty made medieval washing flexible rather than automatic. People did not ask only, "Am I dirty?" They might also ask, "Is the weather safe? Is the body strong? Is the water good? Is the air dangerous? Is the effort worth it? Will this restore balance or disturb it?" These questions belong to a medical imagination where the body was porous, reactive, and deeply connected to its surroundings. That porous body is one of the keys to understanding the fear of frequent hot bathing. The skin was not imagined as a sealed modern barrier. Could open and close, could absorb, could release. Sweat might cleanse, but it might also weaken. Heat might soften, but it might also expose. Cold after heat could shock the body. Steam could comfort the limbs, but it could also invite harmful air. To avoid a bath after plague rumors or in dangerous weather was not necessarily laziness. It could be a kind of protective caution. The modern shower, by contrast, is built on a different confidence. We trust heated water, soap, drains, towels, clean rooms, and medical ideas that link washing with the removal of microbes. Medieval people trusted other things: balance, timing, moderation, visible order, fresh linen, good air, and advice inherited from religious, household, and medical authorities. Their system was often wrong by modern standards, but it was not empty. Soap itself deserves a careful place in the story. Medieval Europe did know soap, and soap-making existed in various forms. Certain regions became known for it, especially where olive oil or other fats and alkaline substances could be combined into usable products. But soap was not always the mild, fragrant, cheap bar on a bathroom shelf. It could be expensive, regional, harsh, or used more for laundry and textile work than for daily bathing. Some households had access to it. Others relied on simpler washing methods. And because soap was not the only marker of clean skin, rubbing mattered. A linen cloth could remove sweat and dirt even without full immersion. Warm water in a basin could cleanse the face and hands. A person could wipe under the arms, around the neck, and over the chest. Feet could be washed after travel or before bed, especially where hospitality customs encouraged it. In some settings, foot washing had religious and symbolic meaning as well as practical value. Feet were especially important because medieval life was walked. Roads were muddy. Shoes were not always waterproof. Floors could be damp. Farmyards, markets, and town streets all marked the lower body. Washing feet could be an act of relief, humility, hospitality, care, or necessity. A traveler arriving at a household might have dust or mud removed before rest. This was not the same as a bath, but it carried a clear recognition that the body collected the road. Hospitality could bring water into social life in gentle ways. Offering washing water to a guest signaled respect. It said the household had enough order, enough resources, and enough manners to receive someone properly. In elite culture, the controlled offering of water could become graceful and ceremonial. In humbler settings, the same idea might appear in rougher form. Either way, washing was not invisible. It belonged to the language of social welcome. Religious life also kept water close. Medieval Christians lived among holy water, baptismal meaning, ritual washing in certain contexts, monastic rules, pilgrimage, and ideas of purity that could be bodily and spiritual at once. But religion did not produce one simple attitude toward the bath. It could encourage humility and cleanliness in some situations while warning against vanity and sensual pleasure in others. The body was to be cared for, disciplined, covered, washed, restrained, and interpreted all at the same time. This tension appears especially around nakedness. A private washing of hands or face raised little concern. A public bathhouse with mixed company, nudity, laughter, food, drink, and possible prostitution raised far more. The issue was not water alone. It was what water allowed people to do when they gathered without the usual boundaries of clothing, rank, and watchfulness. Bathing could blur social lines, could make bodies visible, could turn necessity into pleasure. And medieval authorities were often uneasy when pleasure became difficult to supervise. For women, these concerns could be sharper. A woman's presence in a public bathhouse might be judged differently from a man's, depending on local custom and reputation. Respectability was fragile, and rumors could do harm even when nothing improper occurred. For servants, widows, unmarried women, wives of craftsmen, and women working in towns, the question of where and how to wash was never just practical. It could be tied to safety, surveillance, honor, and the gaze of others. Men also faced judgment, but often in different forms. Excessive grooming might be criticized as vanity. Bathhouse leisure could be mocked as softness or condemned as vice. A man's body was expected to endure labor, weather, travel, and discomfort, yet he also had to appear orderly enough for his station. Cleanliness had to be balanced with masculinity, thrift, and moral discipline. So the daily body lived between two dangers, being too dirty and being too indulgent. That balance is difficult for modern viewers to feel because our world has made bathing morally neutral in many places. To shower daily is often seen as basic hygiene, not luxury. But in the medieval world, a long warm bath could carry meanings. Comfort, wealth, leisure, vulnerability, sensuality, healing, danger, or waste. Context decided which meaning dominated. One person entered warm water as a patient, another as a noble, another as a laborer on a rare holiday, another as a client in a bathhouse whose reputation was uncertain. The physical act might look similar, but the social story around it changed completely. And as medieval towns grew, that social story became harder to control. The more people lived close together, the more cleanliness became a public problem. Wells had to be protected. Waste had to be moved. Butchers, tanners, brewers, dyers, fishmongers, and fullers all used water and produced smells. Streets needed regulation, though regulation was uneven. Civic authorities issued rules about dumping refuse, keeping animals, clearing gutters, and maintaining public order, but rules on parchment did not automatically transform the street. Urban water was a shared resource under constant pressure. The same river might power mills, carry waste, supply washing places, and serve industries. Upstream and downstream mattered. So did season. A dry summer changed water levels. A flood spread filth. A frozen winter made washing harder. The medieval body was tied to weather in a way that modern plumbing has partly hidden from us. This connection to weather made bathing seasonal. A warm day opened possibilities. A cold night closed them. Summer made rivers and streams more tempting, but also raised concerns about stagnant water and smell. Winter made heating more precious and undressing more uncomfortable. Spring mud and autumn damp could cover clothing and feet faster than anyone could clean them. In this sense, medieval cleanliness moved with the year. There were moments when washing became more likely, before major feasts, after travel, before marriage, during illness, after childbirth, at certain religious or social thresholds, or when the weather made it practical. There were also long stretches when partial washing and clean cloth carried most of the burden. A bath was not necessarily a habit in the modern rhythm of morning and evening. It was an event shaped by circumstance, and events by nature could become memorable. A prepared bath in a wealthy home might involve servants moving with quiet efficiency, a tub set near the fire, cloth lining the wood so splinters and rough edges did not scrape the skin, water carried in stages, steam rising slowly, perhaps herbs added partly for scent, partly for imagined health. The room becoming damp and warm, the kind of warmth that required planning. The bather entering not just water, but a rare pocket of managed comfort. For someone with resources, that kind of bath could feel restorative. For someone without them, it could feel almost unimaginable. Not impossible, but distant, as though comfort belonged to another pace of life. And this difference between occasional comfort and ordinary discomfort is where the medieval bath becomes emotionally revealing. It shows us how much of daily life was built around endurance. Not heroic suffering, not constant misery, but the steady acceptance of friction. Cold water, rough cloth, smoky rooms, shared sleeping spaces, limited privacy, dirty streets, tired hands, and bodies that could not be refreshed at will. The modern listener might ask, how did people tolerate it? But people tolerate what their world makes normal. They compare themselves not to future centuries, but to neighbors, relatives, employers, saints, rulers, and stories they already know. A peasant did not wake up longing for a tiled bathroom with hot water pipes. A townswoman did not feel deprived of a washing machine she could not imagine. They knew discomfort, but they measured it within their own world. Still, they sought relief where they could. This is why the decline of full bathing did not erase the desire for freshness. It redirected it toward linen, toward scent, toward grooming, toward controlled washing, toward medical advice, toward public regulation, toward avoiding the worst smells, toward appearing respectable even when the body underneath had not been immersed in warm water for weeks or longer. Respectability could be read at a glance. Was the head covered properly? Was the face reasonably clean? Were the hands acceptable? Was the linen white or gray with wear? Did the person smell strongly enough to offend? Were the nails filthy? Was the hair crawling with pests or carefully combed? These details mattered because they turned private maintenance into public judgment. And for people living near the edge of poverty, that judgment could be unforgiving. Dirt caused by labor might be understood during work, but dirt that seemed to show disorder or neglect could damage reputation. A servant seeking a position, a young woman approaching marriage, a craftsman dealing with customers, a pilgrim asking hospitality, or a trader entering a hall all carried the body as a kind of social document. This is a subtle but important point. Medieval cleanliness was not only about health. It was about credibility. A clean enough appearance could suggest discipline, household order, moral restraint, and competence. A foul or disordered appearance could suggest the opposite, whether fairly or not. In a world where written identification was limited and reputation mattered deeply, the body helped announce who a person was. That made bathing rare in one sense, but bodily presentation constant. People were always being seen, smelled, judged, and placed. They lived close to one another. They slept near one another. They worked shoulder to shoulder. They shared benches, churches, markets, workshops, carts, inns, kitchens, and fields. The body was never entirely private. Even when bathing became less common, the social pressure to remain acceptable did not disappear. And that pressure leads us back toward the public bathhouse, because the bathhouse was one of the few places where the private body became openly collective. It was useful but also unsettling. It promised cleanliness, warmth, and sociability, Yet it concentrated everything medieval society found difficult about bodies: nakedness, class mixing, gossip, pleasure, disease, and money. By the later medieval period, in many towns, the bathhouse stood at a crossroads. Some people still used it. Some authorities still regulated it. Some moralists still warned about it. Some physicians still debated the effects of heat and water. Some entrepreneurs still tried to profit from it. But the confidence around public bathing was beginning to change, and with each outbreak, each sermon, each scandal, and each rise in the cost of fuel, the warm communal bath became a little less secure than it had once been. And as that confidence weakened, medieval people did not suddenly become indifferent to cleanliness. Instead, they carried the burden of cleanliness back into the home, into the linen chest, into the wash basin, into the hands of servants and laundresses, into the small rituals before meals and prayers, and into the careful management of appearances. But the next stage of the story takes us into the places where the bath had once been most alive, the steamy rooms of the public bathhouses themselves, where warmth, business, pleasure, medicine, and suspicion met behind wooden doors, and where the fate of medieval bathing began to turn in a much more public way. Behind those wooden doors, the medieval bathhouse was not merely a room with hot water. It was a small world of heat, labor, noise, steam, towels, wooden benches, buckets, tubs, attendants, gossip, and expectation. To step inside one was to enter a space where the ordinary rules of the street softened for a while. Clothing was removed or loosened. Bodies became more visible. Rank could blur at the edges. A merchant, an apprentice, a traveler, a student, a craft worker, or a guest from another town might all pass through the same warm air, even if not always in the same room or under the same conditions. The bathhouse offered something that most private homes could not easily provide: concentrated warmth. The walls held it. The furnace or stove produced it. Water could be heated in larger quantities than a household basin allowed. Steam could rise and remain. The whole space turned bathing from a difficult domestic project into a service. And that service made sense in crowded towns where many people lacked the room, fuel, and servants to bathe comfortably at home. But the same efficiency that made bathhouses useful also made them vulnerable to criticism. They gathered people together at the very moment when bodies were least protected by the normal signs of social order. Clothing in medieval life did a great deal of work. It marked rank, trade, gender, respectability, season, and household condition. To remove or reduce clothing in a public or semi-public setting was not a neutral act. It made people harder to place. It made the body itself more noticeable. And wherever bodies, heat, leisure, and money came together, suspicion was never very far away. This does not mean that every bathhouse was a scandalous place. Many were practical businesses. They employed attendants, heated water, provided tubs or sweating rooms, and offered washing as a service. Some bathhouses were orderly. Some were licensed. Some were watched by local authorities. Some may have separated men and women by time, room, or custom. In certain towns, they belonged to normal urban life, no more surprising than a tavern, bakehouse, or market stall. But like taverns, bathhouses could be respectable in one moment and questionable in another. The problem was not only what happened inside them. It was what people imagined might happen inside them. Reputation in a medieval town traveled quickly. A place where people undressed, lingered, drank, talked freely, and met beyond the close supervision of family or guild could easily become wrapped in rumor. Even when the primary purpose was washing, the atmosphere of leisure could make moralists uneasy. A warm bath could become a meal. A meal could become drinking. Drinking could become flirting. Flirting could become gossip. And gossip could become civic concern. Medieval authorities often worried less about private sin in the abstract than about disorder spilling into public life. Disorder could mean fighting, drunkenness, debt, prostitution, theft, disease, or households being embarrassed by the behavior of sons, servants, husbands, wives, or travelers. The bathhouse sat close to all of these anxieties, not because it was always corrupt, but because it brought together the conditions in which corruption was easy to imagine. And once a place becomes easy to imagine badly, it becomes difficult to defend simply as useful. The bathhouse owner had to manage more than water. He or she had to manage trust. The business needed customers, fuel, staff, space, drainage, and the permission or tolerance of local authorities. It also needed a reputation clean enough to keep respectable clients from staying away. That balance could be delicate. If the bathhouse became too plain and functional, it might lose the pleasure that attracted customers. If it became too pleasurable, it might invite scrutiny. This was one reason bathhouses could be regulated. Towns might control opening times, prices, conduct, or associations with other activities. In some places, bath keepers belonged to recognized trades. In others, officials treated them with caution. The details varied widely because medieval Europe was not governed by one bathing policy. A bathhouse in a German-speaking town, a French city, an English borough, an Italian commune, or a Central European market center could sit within different local customs and laws. Still, across many places, one pattern slowly became important. Public bathing needed confidence to survive, and confidence could be damaged by several pressures at once. The first pressure was moral unease. The second was disease. The third was cost. And the fourth was changing ideas of the body. At first, a public bathhouse could be defended as healthy. Warm water relaxed muscles, opened the skin, encouraged sweating, and seemed to release impurities. Sweating itself had long been understood as a way the body might expel what troubled it. In a world shaped by humoral medicine, where health depended on the balance of hot, cold, wet, and dry qualities, bathing could be a tool. It could warm a cold body, soften stiffness, ease fatigue, or prepare someone for certain treatments. Bath attendants sometimes offered more than washing. In some places, bathhouses were connected with shaving, cupping, bloodletting, massage, grooming, or simple medical care. This made sense because the bathhouse was already a place where the body was exposed, softened, and attended. A tired worker might go there not only to remove dirt, but to feel restored. A traveler might seek warmth after cold roads. A person with aching limbs might hope that steam and rubbing could bring relief. This is where the medieval bathhouse looks less like a crude version of a modern spa and more like a mixed institution. Part hygiene, part social room, part medical setting, part public business, and sometimes part moral problem. That mixture made it powerful but also unstable. Because if a bath could open the body to healing, it could also open the body to harm. The same pores that might release bad humors might allow dangerous air to enter. The same steam that eased a stiff joint might weaken a person after an epidemic. The same crowd that made the bathhouse lively might make it frightening during plague. Medieval and early modern people did not need germ theory to fear crowded interiors. They had their own language for danger. Corrupted air, foul vapors, imbalance, contagion, and bodily vulnerability. After waves of plague, confidence in crowded warmth could falter. A bathhouse once associated with recovery could be reimagined as a place where the body became too open, too soft, too exposed. If illness was believed to travel through air, smell, or invisible corruption, then a steamy room full of other bodies was not automatically reassuring. Could feel like a trap. This fear did not arrive everywhere in the same year, and it did not erase bathhouses overnight. But it changed the mental weather around them. People could still want warmth, cleanliness, and relief, while also wondering whether the pleasure was worth the risk. Authorities could still tax or regulate bathhouses, while also treating them as possible sources of disorder. Physicians could still prescribe bathing in some cases, while warning against it in others. The bath did not vanish from thought. It became more conditional. A conditional habit is easier to lose than an unquestioned one. When a household already has doubts about public bathing, the rising cost of fuel matters more. When moralists already complain, a rumor of disease matters more. When disease fears rise, any scandal attached to a bathhouse matters more. Each pressure strengthens the others. The warm public bath becomes less like a normal convenience and more like a questionable luxury. This process also tells us something about how societies change. People rarely abandon a practice because of one reason alone. They abandon it when several explanations begin to point in the same direction. A father might say the bathhouse is too expensive. A preacher might say it is morally dangerous. A physician might advise caution after an outbreak. A city official might worry about disorder. A respectable family might prefer private washing at home. None of these reasons alone explains everything. Together, they create a new habit. And once the new habit settles, the old one begins to look suspicious in hindsight. A practice that had once seemed normal can become remembered as excessive. The bathhouse that once served the town can be described as a den of idleness or danger. Warm communal bathing can be pushed from ordinary life toward the edges of reputation. Private washing, clean linen, and careful grooming then step forward as safer signs of cleanliness. That shift was not only about fear, it was also about control. A bath at home could be controlled by the household, could be timed, limited, and hidden. It could be done with a basin rather than a tub, with partial washing rather than immersion, with linen changes rather than public exposure. It could avoid the uncertainty of other bodies, could preserve reputation, could use less fuel, less water, and less trust. For wealthier families, this movement inward could strengthen domestic privacy. The chamber, the linen chest, the servant's pitcher, and the warmed basin became part of a respectable household's quiet management. Cleanliness did not need a public stage. It could be performed through order, fabric, scent, and controlled access to the body. For poorer people, the shift inward was harsher. If the public bathhouse became less available, less trusted, or less affordable, the alternatives were not equally comfortable. A basin did not replace a bath. A cold rinse did not replace steam. A shared household room did not offer the warmth of a dedicated bathing space. So the decline of bathhouses likely reduced access to full bathing most sharply for those who had never possessed much private comfort in the first place. This is one of the hidden class stories inside the history of bathing. When public services decline, the wealthy often retreat into private substitutes. The poor simply lose options. A noble household could still arrange a bath. A prosperous merchant might still command water and fuel. A monastery might maintain washing practices within its own rules. A hospital might bathe patients when care required it. But the urban worker, apprentice, widow, traveler, or servant depended far more on shared facilities. If those facilities came under suspicion, their choices narrowed. The same pattern can be seen in the social geography of towns. Public bathhouses often stood near other places of movement and exchange. Markets, streets of trade, inns, workshops, or districts where water and fuel could be supplied. They needed customers passing through. They needed practical access. Their position made them convenient, but also exposed them to the watchful eye of urban authority. A private basin could vanish into a household. A bathhouse stood in the town's moral imagination, and towns were increasingly interested in regulating bodies. This regulation did not always come from one grand ideology. It came from practical anxieties. Who was allowed to work where? Who could sell what? Where could waste be dumped? Which trades created foul smells? When could taverns operate? How should strangers be watched? How should sickness be contained? The bathhouse became part of this wider urban attempt to manage risk, reputation, and disorder. During times of epidemic, such management could become more urgent. Towns might restrict movement, isolate the sick, clean streets, burn substances believed to purify air, or forbid gatherings thought to be dangerous. Even if such measures were inconsistent or based on incomplete medical ideas, they show an important instinct. Public health was imagined through space, air, contact, and order. A bathhouse, with its steam and close bodies, could easily become suspect within that framework. Yet there is a sadness in this, because the bathhouse was also one of the few places where ordinary people might experience warmth as something more than survival. For many, winter heat meant crowding near a smoky hearth, not relaxing in clean steam. Work heat meant ovens, forges, kitchens, kilns, or fields under sun. Bathhouse heat was different. It was heat for the body's relief. Heat that did not demand labor at the same moment it gave comfort. That made it valuable. The decline of such spaces therefore narrowed not only cleanliness, but pleasure. Medieval life did contain pleasure, and it is important not to strip the past of it. People laughed, feasted, sang, flirted, rested, played games, decorated homes, wore colors, cherished scents, and sought warmth. The bathhouse belonged partly to that world of ordinary pleasure. It was not only hygiene, it was bodily ease. And bodily ease was exactly what could make it morally vulnerable. There is a long history of authorities becoming suspicious of comforts that ordinary people enjoy together. Not because every comfort is harmful, but because shared comfort creates spaces outside strict discipline. A bathhouse allowed people to linger. It created time not directly devoted to work, prayer, household obligation, or market exchange. Even when customers paid, the experience could seem unproductive in a moral sense. The body was being warmed for its own sake. That was enough to make some critics uneasy. The irony is that the same society that made bathing difficult could criticize the places that made it easier. A poor worker could hardly bathe at home, yet the public place that solved the problem might be morally suspect. A woman might need access to washing, yet public visibility could endanger her reputation. A traveler might need warmth and relief, yet the in-district bathhouse might be watched with suspicion. A town might benefit from shared facilities, yet fear the disorder they attracted. Medieval bathing lived inside these contradictions, and contradictions rarely produce neat endings. They produce compromise. Some bathhouses continued. Some changed their services. Some became more restricted. Some disappeared. Some were replaced by more private habits. In certain regions, forms of sweating, washing, or therapeutic bathing remained stronger. In others, the idea of frequent immersion weakened. Over time, especially into the early modern period, the clean body in much of Europe became less associated with regular soaking and more associated with linen, grooming, scent, and controlled wiping. This did not mean that water lost meaning. Water remained everywhere. In baptism, in cooking, in washing hands, in laundering, in medicine, in pilgrimage, in rivers, in mills, in wells, in fountains, in monasteries, in hospitals, in kitchens, in fields. But the full-body warm bath became less central to ordinary respectability than a modern person might expect. And perhaps the most revealing thing is that people could defend this change as sensible. They could say that too much bathing weakened the body. They could say that bathhouses invited vice. They could say that disease made steam dangerous. They could say that fuel was better spent elsewhere. They could say that clean linen proved cleanliness better than soaking did. Each claim had a logic within its world. A modern viewer may still find the result uncomfortable. But discomfort is not the same as stupidity. Medieval people lived with constraints that shaped what seemed wise. They did not possess modern plumbing, modern microbiology, modern privacy, modern heating, modern soap distribution, or modern laundry systems. Their choices grew from the tools and fears they had. To see this clearly, picture a town after rumors of illness begin to move through it. Not necessarily the first terrible days of a great plague, but the nervous days when people begin to look differently at familiar spaces. The market still opens, but voices are lower. A neighbor has heard of deaths in another district. A physician gives advice about air and diet. Priest urges repentance. A city officer watches travelers. A mother keeps children closer. The smell from a ditch seems more threatening than it did the week before. Now imagine the bathhouse in that atmosphere. Yesterday it was warm, lively, useful. Today its steam feels uncertain. The benches remember too many bodies. The towels pass through too many hands. The heat that once promised release now suggests exposure. The door that once invited entry now asks a question. What if comfort is dangerous? Even if many still entered, that question mattered. Could linger after the outbreak passed. It could join old moral concerns and practical costs. It could reshape habits not in one dramatic moment, but by making people hesitate. And when people hesitate often enough, a custom begins to weaken. This is how rarity can grow slowly, not through a single ban, not through a sudden hatred of water, but through repeated hesitation. A household hesitates before spending fuel. A traveler hesitates before entering a crowded bath. A respectable woman hesitates because of reputation. A city council hesitates before renewing licenses. A physician hesitates before recommending hot soaking. A preacher hesitates not at all, but speaks firmly against public indulgence. Each hesitation removes a little confidence from the culture of bathing. And confidence is what made the bathhouse possible. Without it, the bathhouse becomes harder to maintain. Fewer customers mean less income. Less income means poorer facilities. Poorer facilities damage reputation. Damaged reputation attracts fewer respectable users. A place can decline materially and morally at the same time, each decline feeding the other. What was once a civic convenience can become, in the minds of many, a place for the careless, the poor, the reckless, or the morally suspect. This spiral did not happen everywhere in exactly the same way, but it helps explain the broader movement. The bathhouse was fragile because it depended on a public agreement that shared warmth was worth the risks. When that agreement weakened, the medieval body had to find other ways to remain acceptable. And those other ways led deeper into the household. The basin became more important. The cloth became more important. The shirt touching the skin became more important. The smell of linen, herbs, and rooms became more important. The management of hair, nails, teeth, and visible skin became more important. Cleanliness moved from the communal bath to the daily surface of the body. It became less immersive, less watery, less public, and more connected to fabric and appearance. But this shift also created a new problem. If clean linen became central to cleanliness, then cleanliness depended on laundry. And laundry depended on water, labor, weather, fuel, space, and time. The burden did not disappear. It simply moved, often onto women's hands, servants' backs, and the hidden routines of the household. That is where the story must go next, because the decline of public bathing did not make medieval bodies easier to manage. It pushed cleanliness into quieter, more repetitive forms of work. Soaking, scrubbing, airing, beating, drying, folding, storing, and guarding cloth from smoke, damp, insects, and poverty. And in those laundry yards, riverbanks, kitchens, and linen chests, we begin to see how medieval people tried to carry the idea of cleanliness forward, even as the warm bath itself slipped further out of everyday reach. In those laundry yards, riverbanks, kitchens, and linen chests, cleanliness became less like a moment of pleasure and more like a rhythm of labor. It was not the kind of cleanliness that came from sinking into warm water and letting the body soften. It was the kind that came from bending over a tub, lifting soaked cloth, rubbing fabric between tired hands, carrying water in heavy vessels, and watching the sky for enough clear weather to dry what had been washed. The medieval body could be managed through linen, but linen itself had to be managed first. A shirt worn close to the skin absorbed sweat, smoke, oils, and the dust of work. A shift worn under a gown did the same. Sheets, towels, napkins, head coverings, swaddling cloths, table linen, and underlayers all became part of the household's hidden battle against bodily disorder. To modern eyes, these objects may seem ordinary, but in a world without easy laundry, each piece of cloth carried value. It had taken labor to grow flax, process fiber, spin thread, weave fabric, cut it, stitch it, mend it, wash it, and preserve it. Linen was not disposable. It was a stored form of work. This meant that cleanliness depended on ownership before it depended on habit. A person could believe in clean linen and still not have enough of it. A wealthy household might keep chests filled with folded fabric, each layer smelling faintly of wood, herbs, storage, and dry air. A poorer family might own only a few garments and wash them when season, labor, and necessity allowed. The ability to change into something fresh was not just personal discipline. It was material privilege. A clean shirt, then, was not a small thing. It was a sign that someone had spare cloth, water access, time, household help, or at least enough order to keep garments from collapsing into permanent damp and dirt. In later centuries, the white linen visible at collars and cuffs would become a powerful signal of cleanliness and status, but its roots lay in this older practical truth. The fabric touching the skin could become the proof that the body beneath was controlled. And control was the essence of respectable cleanliness. The household that could keep linen clean could create an impression of moral steadiness. Folded cloth suggested order. White cloth suggested care. A clean tablecloth suggested hospitality. Fresh sheets suggested comfort and standing. A washed head covering suggested discipline. These signs mattered because medieval society often judged people through surfaces. The way a person appeared did not tell the whole truth, but it told enough for others to form opinions. Yet each clean surface came from rough work. Laundry was often done in cold water. It might require soaking, pounding, rubbing, rinsing, wringing, and carrying. Hands cracked, backs ached, sleeves became wet. In winter, the labor could be miserable. Cloth absorbed water and became heavy. Drying might take far longer than washing. In damp weather, linen could sour, smoke, or mildew. A household might hang garments near a hearth, but then they absorbed smoke. Hang them outdoors, and they risked rain, mud, animals, theft, and ash from nearby fires. So when people leaned more heavily on linen instead of bathing, they did not escape effort. They moved the effort from the bather to the washer. This is one of the quiet transfers in the history of hygiene. A full bath asked one kind of labor from a household: water carried, fuel spent, tub prepared, space warmed. Linen cleanliness asked another kind: cloth produced, washed, dried, stored, repaired, protected, and replaced. The burden often fell unevenly on women, servants, apprentices, washerwomen, and the lower ranks of large households. The clean appearance of one person could be built from the invisible discomfort of another. In noble and prosperous homes, the laundry cycle could become organized and specialized. There might be storage rooms, servants assigned to linen, careful inventories, and rules about when certain fabrics were issued. A household of rank did not simply own more things. It owned systems. Bedding, table linen, napkins, towels, and clothing could move through an ordered chain from use to washing to drying to folding to storage. That order itself became a form of status. In poorer homes, the system was more fragile. A garment might be worn until washing was absolutely necessary. A single shift might serve longer than comfort allowed. Children's clothes might be patched and passed down. Bedding might be aired more often than washed. Smoke, fleas, damp straw, wool blankets, and shared sleeping spaces complicated every effort. The household could still value cleanliness, but the means to preserve it were thinner. This is why it is misleading to imagine medieval dirt as a simple cultural preference. Often, dirt was the residue of limits. It was what remained when there was not enough spare cloth, not enough heat, not enough dry weather, not enough space, not enough privacy, or not enough time. A person could dislike filth and still live close to it. Airing was one practical answer. Clothes and bedding could be shaken, brushed, beaten, exposed to sun, hung outside, or placed where moving air might freshen them. This kind of cleaning did not require full washing, and it mattered in a world where full washing was hard. A wool cloak could be brushed and aired. Bedding could be turned. Straw could be replaced when possible. Mattresses might be stuffed with straw, wool, feathers, or other materials depending on wealth, and each had its own problems of damp, pests, odor, and maintenance. The bed itself was another hidden center of medieval hygiene. For the wealthy, beds could be large, curtained, layered with sheets, blankets, coverlets, bolsters, pillows, and hangings. A fine bed was a prized object, sometimes listed in wills and household accounts. But comfort brought its own vulnerability. Fabric trapped warmth, and warmth attracted pests. Bed curtains kept out drafts and offered privacy, yet they also held air close. Sheets could be changed, but only if the household possessed enough of them and had servants to launder them. A beautiful bed could hide a complicated struggle against insects, sweat, damp, and smell. For the poor, bedding was simpler and often shared. Several people might sleep in the same bed or room. Children, siblings, servants, travelers, and apprentices could share sleeping arrangements that modern viewers would find intrusive. This closeness made privacy rare and bodily odors unavoidable. It also made pests harder to control. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were not rare intrusions into an otherwise sealed home. They were part of the environment many people expected to manage rather than eliminate completely. Managing pests was another form of cleanliness that did not depend mainly on bathing. Combing hair, changing linen, shaking bedding, using herbs, washing cloth, and avoiding overly dirty sleeping places could all help, but nothing worked perfectly. Insects moved through clothing, straw, animals, people, and rooms. A household might clean and still be reinfested. The problem was not only the body, it was the entire living arrangement. Animals made that arrangement more difficult. In rural households, animals might be close to the home, sometimes separated, sometimes sharing structures, sometimes brought near for warmth, security, or convenience. Chickens, pigs, cattle, sheep, dogs, cats, and horses each brought smell, dirt, hair, parasites, and practical necessity. A person could not simply remove animal life from daily life. Animals were food, labor, wealth, transport, protection, and survival. Their presence made absolute cleanliness impossible, but their absence was not an option. In towns, animals were present too. Horses moved through streets. Pigs rooted where they were allowed or where rules failed. Dogs wandered. Livestock passed through markets. Butchers, tanners, and other trades created waste that washed into gutters or gathered near work sites. The cleaner body left the house into a world that immediately marked it again. Mud and manure clung to hems and shoes. Smoke settled into fabric. Rain splashed filth upward from streets. Cleanliness was constantly being negotiated with the city itself. This is where medieval hygiene becomes a question not only of individual bodies, but of public infrastructure. A town could regulate waste, pave streets, maintain wells, clear ditches, or punish dumping, but enforcement varied. Some streets were better kept than others. Wealthy districts and important routes might receive more attention. Poorer quarters could remain crowded, damp, and dirty. Water channels, gutters, and drains existed in some places, but they did not create a modern sanitary system. The town was always partly cleaned and partly overwhelmed. Public fountains and wells became important social sites because they supplied the water that households needed for cooking, drinking, washing, and laundering. A well was not merely a hole in the ground. It was a shared point of dependence. People met there. Servants waited there. Children might be sent there. Water carriers might earn money there. News traveled there. And the quality of that water could shape the health and habits of an entire neighborhood. But water for washing competed with water for other uses. Drinking came first. Cooking mattered. Brewing mattered. Animals needed water. Crafts needed water. Laundry needed water. A bath, especially a full one, required a large amount by comparison. So even in a place where water was available, the question remained, how much could be spared, and for what purpose? That question became sharper in poorer seasons. Drought lowered streams. Winter froze surfaces. Floods contaminated sources. War damaged infrastructure. A siege could transform water from a daily resource into a strategic crisis. Even without disaster, ordinary scarcity forced choices. A modern person measures water by bills and pipes. A medieval household measured it by distance, weight, labor, and risk. Fuel followed the same pattern. Heating laundry water, bath water, or a room required fire. Fire required wood, charcoal, peat, brush, or other fuels depending on region. In forested areas, access still might be regulated. In cities, fuel had to be brought in and sold. Prices could rise. The poor might gather what they could, buy in small amounts or endure cold. A warm bath consumed fuel that might otherwise cook food, bake bread, brew ale, heat a sick room, or keep damp from settling into bedding. So the rarity of bathing deepened in winter not only because cold water was unpleasant, but because warmth had priorities. The household fire was already under demand. A full bath created steam and comfort, but it also spent heat rapidly. After bathing, the body needed warmth again. Wet hair had to dry. Damp cloth had to be handled. In a cold room, the pleasant bath could be followed by chill, and chill itself was feared. This fear of chill was not imaginary. In unheated or poorly heated spaces, getting wet could be genuinely dangerous, especially for the weak, elderly, very young, or sick. Medieval medical theory may have explained this danger differently from modern medicine, but the experience of cold was real. A person did not need laboratory science to know that damp clothing and winter air could make the body suffer. Here again, partial washing made practical sense. It reduced exposure. Hands, face, feet, and visible areas could be washed without fully undressing. A cloth could clean sweat from underarms or neck without soaking the whole body. Hair could be combed and covered rather than washed frequently. Linen could be changed when possible. These habits were less satisfying than a warm bath, but safer, cheaper, and easier to fit into daily life. The same practicality shaped the washing of infants and the elderly. Babies needed constant cleaning, but too much cold exposure could be feared. The elderly might be frail, slow to warm, and dependent on others. A bath for them required care, not just water. In households with limited resources, washing the vulnerable meant balancing cleanliness against danger. The goal was not modern freshness. The goal was survival with dignity. Childbirth carried its own customs and concerns. The lying-in period after birth was surrounded by care, caution, women's knowledge, religious meaning, and household management. Washing might be necessary, but exposure, chill, bleeding, weakness, and infection risks were understood through the ideas of the time. Warmth mattered. Clean cloth mattered. Help from other women mattered. But again, full bathing depended on resources and belief. The body was treated as open, sensitive, and in need of careful management. This idea of the open body shaped many decisions. The skin, pores, breath, womb, stomach, and blood were all imagined as vulnerable to imbalance or intrusion. A bath might be welcome when it restored order, but dangerous when it disturbed it. A person did not wash simply because dirt existed. They washed according to season, condition, status, and advice. Cleanliness was folded into a wider search for bodily balance. And because balance was personal, bathing could be recommended to one person and discouraged for another. A physician might suggest warm baths for certain pains, stiffness, or humoral conditions. Another might warn a patient against bathing during a dangerous season or epidemic. A household might follow inherited custom rather than learned medicine. A monastery might regulate bathing according to discipline, age, sickness, and rule. There was no single medieval answer because the medieval body was never a single abstract body. It was always particular. Young or old, male or female, rich or poor, sick or strong, noble or laboring, winter cold or summer hot. This complexity made medieval cleanliness both flexible and uneven. At the upper end of society, grooming could become refined. Hair could be arranged carefully, beards trimmed, hands washed ceremonially, perfumed waters used, clothing brushed and layered, linen changed, rooms scented, floors strewn with rushes or herbs, though the reality of rushes varied widely and should not be reduced to the old cliché of endlessly filthy floors. In well-run elite households, order mattered deeply. Yet even there, the standards were different from ours. Cleanliness was visible, scented, managed, and symbolic, not necessarily based on constant immersion. At the lower end, cleanliness was more defensive. It meant keeping the worst of dirt from taking over, washing enough to be bearable, mending clothes before holes widened, removing lice when found, drying damp shoes, shaking bedding, keeping cooking vessels usable, protecting drinking water, rinsing hands before food, wiping a child's face, keeping a work garment from becoming completely ruined. These were small victories, repeated without drama. And repetition is the heart of the subject. A rare bath could be memorable, but cleanliness lived in repetition. The same basin filled and emptied, the same cloth rinsed and wrung, the same garment aired, the same comb drawn through hair, the same ashes swept from a hearth, the same floor cleared, the same bucket carried from the well, the same bed shaken, the same smell returning despite effort. This repetition was exhausting because the medieval environment kept undoing it. Smoke returned, mud returned, sweat returned, insects returned, damp returned, work returned. A body cleaned in the morning did not remain clean through a day of labor. A shirt washed on Monday might be marked by Wednesday. A room aired at noon filled again with smoke by night. Cleanliness was not a permanent achievement. It was a temporary clearing in a world of constant material pressure. That temporary quality may explain why medieval people could value cleanliness without expecting the level of cleanliness modern life demands. They understood that the body and home could be improved, refreshed, made orderly, and prepared for social life. But they did not live inside the fantasy of total separation from dirt. Dirt was not always a failure. Often it was the normal companion of work, weather, and animals. What mattered was whether dirt was appropriate to the moment. A plowman covered in soil during work was different from a guest arriving at a table with unwashed hands. A butcher's apron during slaughter was different from the same filth carried into church. A traveler dusty from the road was different from a host who could not offer even water. A child muddy from play was different from a neglected child crawling with pests. Medieval cleanliness was situational. It asked where the person was, what they were doing, who was watching, and what level of care could reasonably be expected. This situational logic reached into religious spaces as well. Churches gathered bodies of every class into shared air. People stood or knelt close together. They brought with them the smells of labor, wool, leather, smoke, damp, food, sickness, and perfume. Cleanliness before worship could matter, but the church also embraced a population that could not all present itself with elite refinement. The holy and the bodily existed side by side. Water at church had symbolic power, but it did not erase the practical reality of daily grime. Holy water marked the soul, the threshold, the ritual world. It did not provide plumbing. Baptism washed in a spiritual sense more than in a hygienic one. The gap between symbolic cleansing and physical bathing is important because medieval people could think about purity in many layers at once. A person might be spiritually cleansed, morally disciplined, socially respectable, and physically not very clean by modern standards. These categories overlapped, but they were not identical. That overlap could produce tension. Excessive bodily care might be criticized as vanity. Neglect could be criticized as disorder. Monastic traditions often tried to discipline the body without despising it completely. The body needed washing, feeding, rest, and clothing, but not indulgence. This attitude influenced wider Christian culture, though never in one simple way. It encouraged moderation, and moderation could make frequent luxurious bathing look suspicious, especially when associated with pleasure rather than need. The bathhouse, therefore, was vulnerable not only because of disease or cost, but because it made moderation difficult to prove. A person could claim to go for health, but observers might suspect pleasure. A place could claim to offer cleanliness, but critics might imagine vice. A business could operate legally, yet still attract jokes, warnings, and unease. The warm bath had to defend itself from meanings attached to it. Laundry did not face the same moral problem. Washing linen was humble, repetitive, and useful. It did not usually suggest sensual pleasure. It served the household, produced visible order. It fit more easily into moral expectations. So as suspicion gathered around public bathing, linen care could rise as the safer, more respectable form of cleanliness. But safer did not mean easier. A linen-based cleanliness required discipline from the whole household. Cloth had to be kept dry. Chests had to be guarded against damp and insects. Garments had to be patched before they fell apart. Sheets had to be aired. Towels had to be available for guests. Servants had to know which linen belonged where. In large households, the management of linen could become almost administrative. It required memory, hierarchy, accounting, and routine. The linen chest itself becomes a telling object. Closed, dry, and guarded, it represented stored cleanliness. It protected the household's ability to appear orderly in the future. To open it was to draw from a reserve of comfort and respectability. A wealthy chest might contain abundance. A poor chest might reveal how narrow the household's options truly were. In both cases, cloth became a bridge between the unwashed body and the respectable world. And the more we follow that bridge, the more we see that medieval bathing was not only about attitudes toward water. It was about how a society distributes comfort. Warm baths became rare where the structures supporting them weakened. Public trust, cheap fuel, shared facilities, medical confidence, moral tolerance, and urban regulation. Linen cleanliness survived because it could be broken into smaller tasks, carried by household labor, and hidden behind the appearance of order. But hidden labor has its own history. The washerwoman at the river, the servant carrying pitchers, the wife scrubbing garments, the apprentice airing bedding, the child sent to fetch water, the laundress working for an inn, the nun managing infirmary linen, the household officer counting sheets, the poor mother trying to dry a single garment before nightfall. All of them belong to the story of why baths were rare. They show us that the absence of bathing did not mean the absence of effort. It meant effort was redirected into forms less visible to later imagination. And as this labor continued quietly, another force was reshaping the meaning of cleanliness from the outside. The expanding late medieval and early modern fear of contagion, bad air, and bodily exposure. The bath had already become costly and morally complicated. But when disease returned again and again, and when medical advice began to place greater emphasis on sealing, protecting, and guarding the body from dangerous air, even the most ordinary habits of washing could be reinterpreted. The next part of the story begins in that anxious atmosphere, where the skin itself seemed less like something to cleanse deeply, and more like a boundary that had to be defended. In that anxious atmosphere, where the skin itself seemed less like something to cleanse deeply, and more like a boundary that had to be defended, the warm bath lost some of its older innocence. Water had once promised relief, softness, and renewal. Steam had once seemed to draw heaviness out of the body. But now, in many minds, that same warmth could make a person vulnerable. The open pore became a doorway. The relaxed body became an exposed body. The bathhouse, once a place of comfort, began to look like a place where danger might enter before anyone could see it. This fear was not modern science, but it was not random either. Medieval and early modern people watched illness move through households, streets, towns, and regions with terrifying speed. They did not know the world of bacteria and viruses as we understand it, but they knew that some places felt dangerous, some smells seemed corrupt, and some gatherings preceded sickness. Their explanations belonged to their time. Bad air, imbalance, contagion, poisonous vapors, divine judgment, unlucky weather, corrupted matter, and bodies made weak by the wrong conditions. Within that world, a hot bath could become suspicious for reasons that seemed sensible. Heat softened the body. Steam surrounded the breath. Sweat opened the skin. A person leaving the bath might step into cold air, damp clothing, or a crowded street. The very thing that had made bathing pleasant, the feeling of the body becoming loose and open, could be reimagined as the problem. So the decline of bathing was not simply about people refusing to be clean. It was about people changing what they thought cleanliness meant. In a modern bathroom, we usually imagine dirt as something on the surface of the body, something that can be removed with soap and water. But for many people in the later medieval and early modern world, danger did not always sit visibly on the skin. It floated in the air. It rose from marshes, graves, drains, crowded rooms, rotting waste, and infected places. It entered through breath, pores, and imbalance. If danger was invisible and airborne, then soaking the whole body was not always the obvious answer. Guarding the body could matter more. This is one of the great reversals in the story. Bathing declined in part because people were trying to protect health, not because they had entirely abandoned it. They protected it through linen, through air, through scent, through diet, through avoiding certain places, through closing windows at some times and airing rooms at others, through burning herbs, carrying aromatic objects, wearing clean underclothes, and keeping the body covered. Some of these methods helped a little. Some helped not at all. Some were misunderstood. but they formed a system of caution in a world where illness was frightening and medical certainty was limited. The body became something to be managed carefully rather than simply washed often. And this management was deeply social. A person who wore clean linen could appear disciplined. A person who smelled of herbs, rosewater, or carefully stored cloth could seem respectable. A person who avoided disreputable bathhouses could seem morally careful. A household that controlled its bedding, laundry, rooms, and air could present itself as orderly. Cleanliness moved away from the public bath and into a quieter language of fabric, scent, and restraint. The irony is that this form of cleanliness could hide as much as it revealed. A fine collar might look fresh while the body beneath had not been immersed in water for a long time. A scented room might mask damp walls. A clean sheet might cover a mattress alive with pests. A polished appearance might depend on servants who lived with far less comfort. Medieval and early modern cleanliness often worked through surfaces, and surfaces were powerful. But surfaces mattered because people lived in close contact. In a world of shared rooms, shared beds, shared benches, crowded churches, market stalls, workshops, inns, ships, carts, and narrow streets, the body was always being interpreted. Smell, cloth, hair, hands, breath, posture, and grooming all spoke before a person did. A clean enough appearance could protect reputation. It could help someone find work, welcome guests, enter a household, marry well, trade confidently, or simply avoid shame. This was especially important because shame could attach itself to dirt very quickly. Dirt from honest labor might be tolerated, even expected, but dirt that seemed to show laziness, poverty beyond control, illness, or moral looseness could mark a person harshly. Cleanliness was never only a private matter. It was a social negotiation, and the warm bath, once public, became increasingly difficult to place within that negotiation. Was it health? Was it pleasure? Was it vanity? Was it danger? Was it medicine? Was it temptation? Different people answered differently, but the uncertainty itself weakened bathing as a normal habit. By the end of the medieval period and into the early modern world, the full bath in much of Europe had become more occasional, more medical, more elite, more private, or more suspect than it had been in some earlier urban settings. It did not vanish entirely. That is important. People still bathed in certain circumstances. Mineral springs and therapeutic waters remained important. Elite households could still arrange baths. Some communities preserved stronger washing traditions. Ritual bathing continued in religious contexts. Travelers encountered different customs in different regions. But for many ordinary Europeans, the regular warm full-body bath was no longer the center of cleanliness. Instead, cleanliness became something smaller, more frequent, and more fragmented. Hands before meals, face in the morning, feet after travel, linen against the skin, hair combed and covered, teeth picked or rubbed, clothes aired, bedding shaken, rooms scented, bodies protected from chill, public exposure avoided, warm immersion saved for special occasions, illness, luxury, or necessity. This fragmented cleanliness may feel unsatisfying to us, but it made sense within its world. It used less water. It used less fuel. It demanded less privacy. It avoided the risks of crowded bathhouses. It suited medical ideas that feared open pores and dangerous air. It allowed households to display order without constantly organizing a full bath. It fit the limits of medieval architecture, labor, and economy. The cost, of course, was comfort. A basin could clean the hands, but it could not give the same relief as immersion. A fresh shirt could absorb sweat, but it could not wash away the fatigue of a long season. Herbs could sweeten a room, but they could not remove the damp inside the walls. A comb could fight lice but not end the conditions that brought them back. Linen could create respectability but not equal access to ease. So when we ask why medieval baths were so rare, we are really asking why comfort was so difficult to organize. The answer is not one reason, but a layered one. Water was heavy, fuel was costly, privacy was limited, labor was constant, public bathhouses were morally complicated. Disease made shared steam frightening. Medical ideas warned that open pores could invite danger. Linen offered a safer-looking substitute. Social respectability shifted toward visible order rather than frequent immersion. And for the poor, every solution required work they could barely spare. This is why the story matters. It reminds us that daily habits are never only personal habits. They are built by systems. Modern people bathe often because an enormous hidden structure allows it. Pipes, sewers, water treatment, fuel networks, electricity, soap industries, private rooms, towels, laundry machines, medical knowledge, and cultural expectations. Remove those structures and the habit changes quickly. Medieval people lived without most of them. Their world did not make the full warm bath impossible, but it made it expensive, awkward, risky, and socially uncertain. That is the central truth behind the rarity of medieval baths. The medieval bath was not just an act of washing. It was a meeting point of technology, class, religion, medicine, reputation, and labor. For a noble, it could be arranged. For a patient, it might be prescribed. For a monk, it might be regulated. For a traveler, it might be sought at an inn or bathhouse. For a townsman, it might be a paid convenience. For a poor laborer, it might be a rare event. For a respectable woman, it might be shaped by privacy and reputation. For a washerwoman, it might not be a comfort at all, but another person's cleanliness translated into her own cold, repetitive work. The same bath meant different things depending on who entered it, who prepared it, who paid for it, who judged it, and who cleaned up afterward. That is why the easy picture of the dirty Middle Ages is so misleading. It flattens a complex world into an insult. Medieval people were not modern people with bad habits. They were people living under different pressures, with different tools, different fears, and different explanations for the body. They noticed dirt. They noticed smell. They valued order. They sought relief. They worried about disease. They judged appearances. They made compromises. And sometimes those compromises looked strange only because we no longer feel the weight of the bucket, the price of the firewood, the cold of the room, the crowding of the house, the suspicion around the bathhouse, or the fear that warm water might open the body to danger. To understand them, we have to restore those burdens. We have to picture the labor before the bath. The water drawn, lifted, carried, heated, poured, and guarded. We have to picture the household rearranged for privacy. We have to picture the steam in a wooden room, the cost of every piece of fuel, the servant waiting with a towel, or the poor family choosing instead to wash only what was necessary. We have to picture the bathhouse door, inviting warmth but also rumor. We have to picture the town after plague, where even comfort could begin to feel unsafe. And then we have to picture what replaced the bath. The linen chest, the wash basin, the comb, the towel, the herbs, the airing line, the riverbank, the cracked hands of the laundress, the smoke-darkened room, the child sent for water, the shirt hung near a fire, the careful face washed before entering a hall or church. That is where medieval cleanliness truly lived. Not in the absence of care, but in the constant effort to create a little order against a world that kept undoing it. There is something quietly human in that effort. People did not always have comfort, but they still reached for dignity. They could not always be fresh, but they tried to be acceptable. They could not always control disease, but they tried to protect the body. They could not always bathe, but they washed, wiped, combed, aired, changed, scented, and adjusted. They lived with compromises that were not romantic, but they were understandable. And perhaps that is the most useful way to leave this history. The rarity of medieval baths was not proof that the past was simple or foolish. It was proof that even the most ordinary human acts depend on the world around them. A bath is never just water. It is fuel, labor, belief, architecture, privacy, medicine, and trust. When those things are easy, bathing feels natural. When they are difficult, cleanliness takes other forms. So the next time we imagine a medieval person without a modern bath, the more honest question is not, why did they choose dirt? It is, what kind of world made cleanliness so hard to achieve? And if one detail from this history stayed with you, it might be worth asking what surprised you most. The fear of open pores, the cost of warm water, the suspicion around bathhouses, or the hidden labor behind clean linen. Thank you for spending this quiet stretch of history here. If you enjoy calm, thoughtful journeys into the strange realities of the past, you're always welcome to return for the next one.